Taehyung reveals the heartbreaking reason he won't marry in 2027. Jungkook hears it and his world completely shifts. No one knows what I gave up for love. And maybe that's the point. The silence inside the green room was unnerving. The echo of Taehyung's voice hung like a ghost between them, wrapping itself around Jungkook's stunned figure like a fog. Makeup brushes clattered to the floor as the stylist froze mid-step, but neither of them moved. The world beyond the walls, the cameras, the stage rehearsals, it all ceased to exist the moment those words left Taehyung's mouth. Jungkook's throat tightened. What do you mean you're not getting married in 2027? He asked, voice low, already dreading the answer. His hands were still wrapped in the faded hoodie sleeves he hadn't taken off since arriving that morning. Taehyung's hoodie, ironically. The one he always wore when things felt uncertain. It smelled like citrus and something nostalgic. Taehyung didn't look at him. His eyes were fixed on the mirror, but not seeing himself. Not really. I made a promise, he murmured, fingers curling around the edge of the dressing table. Years ago, I never broke it. What promise? Jungkook's voice cracked, stepping closer, each footstep uncertain. To who? Taehyung turned then, finally meeting Jungkook's eyes. And in them, Jungkook saw something unfamiliar. Not anger, not sadness, but a kind of resigned devastation, as if he had already lived through the heartbreak 1,000 times and survived, barely. To someone I loved, Taehyung said. To someone I failed. And suddenly, the air felt thinner. Years ago. That phrase replayed in Jungkook's head like a haunting loop. Back in 2023, when everything still felt electric and golden. When nights were spent in music studios, in dim hallways behind stages, in secret hotel rooms away from flashing cameras. There were whispers back then. Whispers about Taehyung's heart, about someone who had it. But no one ever knew who. Except maybe Jungkook. You're still in love with them? Jungkook asked quietly, afraid of the answer. Taehyung didn't nod, didn't shake his head either. Some people leave, he said, but never really leave. You learn to carry them with you. In everything, even in silence. It wasn't the kind of silence that could be filled. Not with music, not with applause, not even with time. Jungkook's heart pounded. There was a heaviness in his chest that had nothing to do with exhaustion. He hated this. Hated not knowing. Hated the mystery that always curled itself around Taehyung like a second skin. But more than anything, he hated that this seemed like the end of something. You always said you wanted a family, Jungkook whispered. You said by 2027 you'd settle down. You told me in Busan, remember that? At the pier? Taehyung's lips twitched, a ghost of a smile, almost bitter. People change, he replied. Dreams change. No, Jungkook snapped, stepping forward now, anger bubbling up because it was easier than sorrow. You changed, and you never told me why. There it was, the real reason. Not about weddings, not about headlines, not about fans or contracts or timing. This was about something or someone that broke Taehyung in ways Jungkook hadn't seen, or maybe refused to see. I can't marry someone, Taehyung finally said, voice trembling, when my heart never really came back. The silence hit harder than the truth. Jungkook took a shaky breath, eyes glossing over. Who was it? Taehyung hesitated, and then said the name like a prayer he still wasn't ready to let go of. The name wasn't someone famous, wasn't someone the world would recognize, but it was someone real, someone who had touched him, changed him, marked him. Jungkook felt the ground shift beneath him, and in the quiet that followed, Taehyung looked away again. I told them I'd wait, he whispered, even if they never came back. I said I wouldn't love again. Not like that. And I meant it. Jungkook felt a weight settle in his chest that no amount of air could clear. The pain in Taehyung's voice wasn't romantic, it was raw, unforgiving. Deep. You're punishing yourself, Jungkook said, for something that wasn't your fault. But Taehyung just shook his head, slow and deliberate. It was, he murmured. I chose music, fame, the spotlight. I didn't choose them, and they walked away. He laughed then, dry and bitter. Funny thing is, I kept thinking I'd find someone else, someone easier, someone safer, but no one ever fit. Jungkook wanted to say something, anything, but his words failed him. Taehyung stood then, slowly. He picked up the old notebook on the table, the one he always carried. the one no one was ever allowed to read. I wrote letters to them, he said almost to himself, every year on the same day. Jungkook's throat closed. He had seen that notebook before, once, in Tokyo. Taehyung had fallen asleep with it open beside him, pages stained with tear marks and ink. The mystery hadn't been mystery at all. It had been morning. Taehyung glanced at Jungkook again, softer now. "I'm not broken," he said gently. "I just decided to live with the crack." The door opened behind them. Manager Nim peeked in, announcing it was time for rehearsal. Taehyung nodded, wiped the corner of his eye with the sleeve of his jacket, smiled like nothing had happened, like he hadn't just revealed the deepest truth he had buried. And just like that, he walked out. Jungkook stood frozen, the taste of the confession still heavy on his tongue. Maybe the world would keep asking why Taehyung wasn't getting married in 2027. But Jungkook now knew the truth. And it changed everything. Jungkook couldn't concentrate for the rest of the rehearsal. The lyrics slipped from his mouth with less conviction, his moves slightly delayed, like his body was stuck 2 seconds behind his mind. Each beat of the music pulsed against the walls of his chest, reverberating with the weight of Taehyung's words. His ears still echoed with him. I made a promise to someone I loved, to someone I failed. He had always known there were things Taehyung kept hidden. They all did. Fame came with walls. Not everyone was allowed in. But Jungkook, he had always believed that if there were cracks in those walls, he'd be the one Taehyung let peek through. He had believed he was the exception. But maybe he never was. After rehearsal ended, the others drifted away, joking about late dinners and long showers, while Jungkook lingered near the hallway that led to the dressing rooms. The hallway was dim, quieter than usual, save for the distant hum of staff packing up equipment. The door to Taehyung's room was closed, but he could hear soft guitar strumming behind it, delicate, slow, melancholic. He stood there for a long time before raising his hand and knocking. The music stopped. A moment passed. Then, "Come in." Jungkook pushed the door open slowly. Taehyung sat on the couch, guitar in his lap, notebook beside him. A half-empty bottle of iced tea sat on the table. The overhead lights were off, only the warm glow of a corner lamp casting soft shadows across the room. "You okay?" Jungkook asked, voice hesitant. Taehyung looked up at him with tired eyes. Not sad, just used. "Depends," he replied, fingers still resting on the strings. "You here as Jungkook the friend, or Jungkook the person who needs answers?" Jungkook stepped inside, closed the door behind him. "Both." Taehyung gave a small smile, patted the empty space beside him. Jungkook took it, the leather of the couch cool under his legs. There was silence again, not awkward. Just the kind that settles between two people who know the next words might break something. "You don't talk about them," Jungkook finally said. "No," Taehyung replied, voice soft. "I don't." "But you love them," Taehyung nodded, barely perceptible. "I still do. Even now?" He turned his head slowly, meeting Jungkook's gaze with something fragile behind his eyes. Especially now. Jungkook's heart twisted. He didn't know why it hurt so much, why it felt like mourning something that was never his to begin with. Maybe because somewhere deep down, a part of him had been waiting, hoping that if the timing ever aligned, if the stars shifted just right, maybe he and Taehyung could be more than what they were. But the stars had already aligned once, long ago, for someone else. "Why didn't you go after them?" Jungkook asked, not accusing, just bewildered. Taehyung exhaled slowly. "Because they didn't ask me to." "But you wanted to." "Desperately," Taehyung whispered, "but wanting isn't enough." They walked away because they needed to know they were chosen. That if I had to pick, I'd pick them over everything else. And I didn't. I stayed. I kept singing. I smiled in interviews. I told the world I was fine. I didn't chase them. I thought maybe they'd come back. "But they didn't," Jungkook said quietly. "No," Taehyung said, "and I don't blame them." Jungkook felt his chest ache. The kind of ache that didn't bruise the skin but left marks anyway. "Is that why you can't marry? Because you're still holding on to them?" Taehyung shook his head. "Not just because of them, because of me." Jungkook frowned. "I realized," Taehyung continued, eyes distant, "that the version of me who could love that deeply doesn't exist anymore. I left him behind when I let them go. The version of me that believed in forever, in promises, in happy endings. I buried him with that last message I never sent. Jungkook's voice was almost a whisper. You wrote it? I wrote hundreds, Taehyung said, laughing softly, bitterly. Never sent a single one. He reached for the notebook on the table, flipping to a page. He didn't hand it over, just stared at it. I've tried to love others, he said. Not because I wanted to move on, but because I wanted to pretend I could. I wanted to forget, but they always feel it, the distance, the way I never fully show up, like I'm saving something for someone else. Because I am. Jungkook didn't know when his hand had moved, but it was there now, resting gently on Taehyung's. Not romantic, just human. I don't want to see you alone forever, he said. Taehyung looked at him and something in his face softened. I'm not alone, he said. Not really. I have you. I have the guys. I have music, but it's not the same. No, Taehyung agreed. It's not, but it's enough for now. The room fell into quiet again, the kind that spoke louder than words. Jungkook wanted to scream. He wanted to shake him, to say this wasn't fair, that he deserved more than memories and unopened letters and ghosted promises. But he didn't. He knew Taehyung wouldn't listen, not because he didn't care, but because he had already made peace with his sorrow. He wore it like a second skin, familiar, comfortable, unwilling to shed. Do they know? Jungkook asked finally. How much you still love them? I don't think they care, Taehyung said, closing the notebook. Or maybe, I don't think they want to know, because it would make leaving harder, and I want them to be free. Jungkook looked down at their hands, still touching, still real. You could love again, he said. If you tried. Taehyung leaned back, resting his head against the couch. Maybe, but not in 2027. They sat like that for a long time, the lamp casting golden halos around their shadows, the city lights flickering beyond the window like stars that refused to sleep. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed and faded into silence. And inside the room, two people sat, one with the past he couldn't let go of, the other with a future he didn't know how to claim. When Jungkook finally left the room, he didn't say goodbye. And Taehyung didn't stop him. Because some stories are not meant to be rewritten. And some hearts are meant to stay broken. The next morning came not with sunlight, but with a curtain of gray mist clinging to the Seoul skyline. Raindrops tapped against the studio window like quiet memories begging to be let in. Jungkook stood alone in the recording booth, headphones on, staring down at the lyrics on the monitor in front of him, but his lips didn't move. The track played through his headset, an unfinished ballad Taehyung had been working on months ago, but his voice, his breath, refused to follow. The words blurred in his vision. Every line read like a message, not from the songwriter to the audience, but from Taehyung to someone he still couldn't name. And it hurt. Not because Jungkook didn't understand, but because he did. Too much. He exited the booth without saying a word, brushing past the sound engineer with an apologetic nod. Down the hallway, the lights flickered as footsteps echoed soft, careful. He wasn't looking for Taehyung, but part of him hoped he'd see him anyway. They hadn't spoken since the night before. Not even a text. And in a world where they used to speak without words, that silence was thunder. Back in his car, Jungkook sat behind the wheel for what felt like hours. The rain poured harder, cascading down the windshield until the city outside looked like a dream falling apart. His fingers tapped anxiously against the steering wheel, heart pounding with questions he didn't know how to ask. Was he angry at Taehyung? No, not really. Just lost, just aching. For him, for what they used to be, for what they never became. When he finally started the engine, it wasn't home he drove to. It was the Han River. He parked and sat on the stone steps overlooking the water, his hoodie pulled tight, headphones still clinging to his neck. The cold air bit into his skin, but he welcomed it. Anything to feel something real, something not tangled in secrets. And then he heard footsteps. He didn't need to look to know who it was. Taehyung sat beside him without speaking. His coat was long, dark, soaked at the shoulders. His hair fell messily across his forehead, damp from the rain. They sat like that for minutes, maybe longer. Time felt meaningless there, only the sound of water lapping against the riverbank and the occasional car humming past behind them. You knew I'd come here, Jungkook finally said. You always do, Taehyung replied. When you need to breathe. Jungkook let out a bitter laugh. Feels ironic. I'm here because I can't. Taehyung looked down at his hands. I didn't mean to hurt you. I know, Jungkook whispered, but it doesn't mean you didn't. They were quiet again. I think, Jungkook began, voice fragile, a part of me always hoped it was me. The one you were writing about. The one you promised yourself to. Taehyung's eyes widened just slightly, but he didn't deny it. And that silence, God, that silence said everything. I used to wait for signs, Jungkook continued. A glance. A lyric. A second too long looking at me backstage. I told myself I was imagining it. Then I told myself I wasn't. Then I stopped trying to figure it out. Taehyung turned to him then, really turned. I was scared, he said, of ruining everything, of giving you something you didn't want. Jungkook looked at him with red-rimmed eyes. And what if I did? I didn't want to gamble you. That wasn't your choice to make. The pain in Taehyung's face was real, raw, unapologetic. I've loved you, Jungkook, he said, not in a fairy tale kind of way, not in a clean, poetic kind of way, in a way that terrified me, in a way that made me write songs I never released, in a way that made me choose silence because I thought it would protect you. Jungkook swallowed hard. And now, Taehyung whispered, I don't know how to unlove you, but I also don't know how to give you all of me when parts of me are still buried in the past. Jungkook looked away, eyes glistening under the faint streetlights. So what do we do? Taehyung exhaled shakily. I don't know. Jungkook turned to him again, this time more firmly. Do you still believe love is only real if it ends in heartbreak? No, Taehyung said. I believe love is real when it stays, even if it's unspoken. Jungkook reached out, his fingers brushing against Taehyung's, testing the distance. Then let's speak it. Taehyung looked at their hands. And if I'm not whole, then we'll figure out how to be whole together. Tears slipped down Taehyung's cheek before he could stop them. He didn't move. He didn't speak. But when his fingers slowly curled around, Jungkook's trembling, unsure, something shifted. Not in the world, but in them. A quiet beginning. Not a confession. Not a promise. Just a choice. Back at the studio days later, they worked side by side again. Something was different, softer. Not all forgiven, not all healed, but no longer running. Taehyung finally opened that notebook. Not for the world, just for Jungkook. He read the letters aloud one by one. Some were angry, some were shattered, some were full of longing so deep it bled through the page. And when he reached the last one, he looked up and said, this one's for you. It wasn't the ending anyone expected, but maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning they deserved. The room was dim, lit only by the amber glow of the desk lamp as Taehyung's voice trembled through the last letter. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was thick, brimming with emotions that neither of them could put into words. Jungkook sat still across from him, his gaze steady, yet his fingers nervously curled into the hem of his sleeves. The weight of every unspoken year, every moment they could have chosen each other and didn't, pulsed between them like a living thing. Taehyung looked down at the notebook one last time, then gently closed it, pressing his palm over the cover as though trying to still the ache beneath it. I never read those out loud before, he murmured, almost like an apology. I didn't think I ever would. Jungkook's voice was soft but steady. You didn't write them for yourself, Tae. You wrote them because you couldn't let go. Taehyung glanced at him, something fragile in his eyes. And now? Jungkook leaned forward, elbows on his knees, voice quieter than a whisper. Now I think you're finally starting to let them go by letting someone else in. A breath caught in Taehyung's throat. I'm not asking you to be okay overnight, Jungkook said. I'm not even asking you to be mine. I just want you to stop being afraid of choosing again, even if it's not me, even if it takes time. Taehyung's eyes burned, and he looked away, blinking hard. You always say the right things, he said with a weak laugh. It's almost cruel. It's not about being right. It's about meaning it. And he did. God, he did. Jungkook had spent years living in the periphery of Taehyung's light, too close to escape, too far to touch it. He had come to terms with the idea that maybe Taehyung would never see him the way he saw Taehyung. But now, sitting here, he realized that maybe it had never been about being seen. Maybe it was about being present when Taehyung finally dared to look. The next few days passed like slow rain. Not heavy, not loud, but constant. They didn't talk about what happened at the river, They didn't need to. The air between them had shifted, subtle but real. Taehyung smiled more. The real kind. The one that didn't ask for cameras to capture it. He started humming again in the hallways, tapping rhythms into the walls like music lived under his skin again. But some nights, Jungkook would catch him staring at the sky like he was searching for answers in constellations that no longer aligned. And those nights, Jungkook stayed silent. He understood the weight of nostalgia, the way grief doesn't leave it, just quiets until a certain song, a scent, a date on the calendar makes it roar again. Then one morning, Taehyung showed up at Jungkook's apartment unannounced. A box in his arms and a strange expression on his face somewhere between determination and fear. "I need your help," he said, stepping in before Jungkook could respond. Jungkook closed the door behind him. "With what?" Taehyung set the box on the kitchen counter and opened it. Inside were handwritten letters, a faded bracelet, a silver ring, a dried flower pressed in a glass frame, and a photo creased and worn of Taehyung and the person Jungkook had only ever heard about in pieces. "I kept everything," Taehyung said. "Every piece, every memory." Jungkook approached slowly. "You want to throw them away?" Taehyung hesitated. "I want to stop worshiping them." It wasn't anger in his voice, it was closure. "I've been living with ghosts," he said. "Loving someone who doesn't exist anymore, not because they're gone, but because they're not the same person I loved. And maybe I'm not either." Jungkook nodded, saying nothing, just giving him space. Taehyung picked up the photograph and stared at it for a long moment. "I thought if I held on to these, I'd remember who I used to be. But all I did was delay who I could become." He set the photo down, his hands shaking slightly. "I'm ready," he said, "but I don't want to do it alone." Jungkook stepped forward and, without hesitation, placed his hand over Taehyung's. "You're not alone," he whispered. They spent the afternoon together, going through the box. Not throwing things away recklessly, but choosing. Choosing what mattered, what memories were worth keeping, which ones were worth releasing. Some items went into a fire Taehyung lit on his rooftop. Some were buried in a small garden box. Others he kept not out of mourning, but out of gratitude. As the sun set, Taehyung leaned back against the balcony railing, watching the smoke curl into the darkening sky. "I'm not who I was in 2023, he said. Jungkook stood beside him. "Neither am I. Do you think..." Taehyung hesitated. "Do you think we missed our chance?" Jungkook shook his head. "No, I think we just weren't ready." Taehyung looked at him, eyes soft. "And now? I think we're still figuring it out." A smile tugged at Taehyung's lips. "That sounds terrifying." "It is," Jungkook admitted. "But maybe that's how we know it matters." A beat passed. "Tell me something real," Taehyung said. "Right now. No lies." Jungkook turned to him, heart in his throat. "You've always been the person I hoped would choose me. And even when you didn't, I stayed." Taehyung blinked slowly. "Why?" "Because love doesn't vanish just because it's not returned. It evolves." Taehyung looked away, his jaw tightening. "You deserve more than a maybe." "I don't want a promise," Jungkook said. "I want a beginning." That night, for the first time in a long time, Taehyung slept without the notebook beside him. He left it closed on his bookshelf, not buried, not burned, just shelved. A chapter ended, not erased. Weeks passed. They grew quieter with each other, not because of distance, but because of comfort. The silence between them no longer felt heavy. It felt safe. One night, during a late studio session, Taehyung played a melody he hadn't shared with anyone yet. Raw, unfinished, bare bones of a song built from both sorrow and hope. He looked at Jungkook across the piano and said, "Help me finish it." Jungkook nodded, took the seat beside him, and added a line. Then another. Then another. And just like that, something began. Not a romance. Not yet. But something real. Because sometimes healing doesn't come with grand declarations or cinematic reunions. Sometimes it comes in quiet notes shared in dim studios, in boxes unpacked together, in choosing to stay even when it's easier to run. And in that space, between memory and music, Taehyung finally found the answer to a question he'd been avoiding for years. Why won't he get married in 2027? Because he's not chasing closure anymore. He's choosing presence.
It was strange how something so small could change the shape of your entire life. A single note, a moment of eye contact, a word not spoken, and everything shifted. Taehyung sat in the empty studio well past midnight, the piano lid lifted, his fingers grazing over the keys but not playing them. Not yet. He was waiting, not for music to find him, but for courage. The quiet wasn't lonely tonight. It was thoughtful. It was the kind of quiet that held space for healing. When the door creaked open and Jungkook stepped inside, hair still damp from the misty Seoul air, Taehyung didn't look up. He didn't need to. He felt him, like he always did. Not like a presence entering the room, but like something returning home. Jungkook walked silently across the floor, dropped his backpack on the couch, and sat beside Taehyung on the piano bench, their shoulders brushing. He didn't say a word, just reached forward and played 2 notes, soft, sustained, like a beginning that had waited too long. Taehyung added the next 3, and suddenly they were playing something that didn't exist before that moment. They weren't composing, they were confessing. The melody was unpolished, raw, unresolved, but there was something beautiful about its incompleteness. It was a reflection of them, not perfect, but honest. They played until the sky outside began to pale, until the streetlights blinked off one by one, until the studio felt like a capsule of time suspended between yesterday and tomorrow. When Taehyung finally spoke, it was with a voice that sounded steadier than it had in months. "I'm not afraid of being alone," he said, "but I'm tired of pretending that I prefer it." Jungkook looked at him, fingers still pressed on a fatting chord. "You don't have to pretend anymore." Taehyung turned to him, the soft glow of morning casting gold across his features. "It's not just about love, Jungkook, it's about trust, about letting someone see me when I'm not performing, when I'm not beautiful, when I'm lost." "I've seen you at your worst," Jungkook said gently, "and it only made me want to stay more." Taehyung's throat tightened. "And I've spent years pushing people away because I thought staying meant settling." "You don't have to settle with me," Jungkook said. "You just have to be real." For a long time, Taehyung didn't speak. He looked down at his hands, his artist's hands, calloused and beautiful and always reaching for something that hurt to touch. And then, finally, he said it. "I don't want to get married in 2027. Jungkook blinked. "I know. Not because I'm incapable of love," Taehyung continued, eyes fixed on the keys, "but because I'm still learning how to love myself in a way that doesn't demand perfection." Jungkook's reply was soft. "That's the only kind of love that lasts." Taehyung exhaled, slow and deep, and then pressed a note on the piano so gently it was barely audible. "Do you ever think we're just 2 people who found each other too late?" Jungkook shook his head. "No, I think we were just becoming the people we needed to be first." They left the studio together as the city began to wake up, walking side by side with no rush, no destination. The streets were quiet, the air crisp. A coffee shop opened its doors and they stepped inside, ordered 2 Americanos and sat by the window, their knees touching under the table. For the first time in years, Taehyung talked about things he'd locked away, about the person he lost, about the guilt he carried, about the therapy sessions he abandoned midway, the songs he wrote in tears, the dreams he let die quietly because he didn't think he deserved them anymore. And Jungkook listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer easy fixes. He just stayed, steady, present. And when Taehyung's voice faltered, he reached across the table and squeezed his hand once. It was enough. The days that followed were simple. No grand gestures, no declarations. Taehyung invited Jungkook to help him design the visuals for his solo project, and they spent late nights sketching storyboards, laughing over ridiculous ideas, arguing about lighting and symbolism, only to land on something meaningful that felt like both of them. One afternoon, they visited an art gallery downtown, and Taehyung stood in front of a painting of a man standing alone on a cliff and whispered, "This used to be me." Jungkook nodded, "Not anymore." They didn't define what they were becoming. They didn't need to. The world would give it labels eventually, but between them, it was just real, safe, honest. One night, as rain tapped softly against the window, Taehyung walked into the living room where Jungkook was curled up on the couch, watching an old film with subtitles too fast to follow. He didn't say anything, just climbed beside him, pressed his head to Jungkook's shoulder and breathed in. "I don't know how to love gently," Taehyung admitted after a while. "When I love, it consumes me." Jungkook looked down at him, brushing his fingers gently through his hair. "Then I'll learn how to stand in your fire." Taehyung laughed, the sound muffled against his hoodie. "You already are." And so they continued, not rushing, not labeling, just choosing. Every day, again and again, even on the hard days, especially then. Taehyung never announced to the press that he wasn't getting married in 2027. He didn't have to. The silence was its own kind of truth, a quiet rebellion against the expectation that love always needed a ceremony to be valid. He didn't need a tuxedo or a stage or a headline. He needed peace. He needed someone to hold his hand when the memories returned like ghosts. He needed someone who wouldn't walk away when his smile cracked. And he found that, not in a future he once imagined, but in the present he almost ran from. And Jungkook, for all his patience and pain and quiet waiting, never said, "I told you so." He simply stayed. That was enough. That was everything. There was a certain beauty in the rhythm they had settled into. Not a perfect one, but organic, like jazz, filled with subtle improvisations and unpredictable notes that somehow always resolved into something whole. Taehyung had begun sleeping a little longer. The bags under his eyes didn't vanish overnight, but they softened. He smiled with his whole face again. And Jungkook, who once walked on eggshells around him, now moved like he belonged in the same space, like his presence was no longer a question, but a quiet answer Taehyung had stopped resisting. They didn't talk about love directly, as if doing so might shatter the fragile sanctuary they were building day by day. But it was there, tangible in every mundane moment, in the way Jungkook poured Taehyung's coffee without asking how he liked it, in the way Taehyung lingered in a doorway just to hear Jungkook sing under his breath, in the way they looked at each other like the past no longer owned them. One morning they woke to the sound of soft rain, and instead of rushing into schedules and obligations, they stayed in bed. The world outside blurred against the fogged-up window, and for the first time in what felt like forever, time didn't matter. Taehyung's voice was groggy, muffled against the pillow. "If I said I was scared of losing this, would you think less of me?" Jungkook shifted beside him, sliding his hand across the sheets until it found Taehyung's fingers. "No, I think you finally started to care enough to be scared." Taehyung smiled faintly. "I've always cared, I just didn't know what to do with it." Jungkook squeezed his hand. "Do this, stay." So Taehyung stayed. The months bled into one another with the changing of the seasons. Summer's heat softened into the cool winds of early autumn. Trees painted the streets with fading gold and amber, and something in the air felt cleaner, like it had rained just enough to wash away the weight of what had once been too much to carry. Jungkook's solo project began picking up momentum. Interviews, rehearsals, meetings. The machine of fame began moving around him again, loud and demanding. But this time, Taehyung didn't feel pushed away by it. Instead, he showed up quietly backstage, sitting in the shadows while Jungkook stood beneath the lights. When Jungkook looked for him, he was always there, hand resting on the edge of the equipment crate, lips tilted in a private smile meant only for him. It was Taehyung's way of saying, "I see you." And it was all Jungkook needed to breathe through the noise. Then came the offer. A major network proposal, a documentary, centered on the artistry of the members' post-group activities. Raw, intimate, honest. The producers wanted to feature Taehyung and Jungkook together, drawn by the unspoken magic people had long sensed between them, on stage, off stage, in glimpses and moments and rumors that never fully died. Taehyung was hesitant. "They'll want us to define this," he said one night. Packing the living room, the offer printed on the table like it was burning a hole through the wood. "They'll dig, they'll assume." Jungkook watched him calm. Let them. Taehyung stopped packing, and if it changes everything. Then it changes everything, Jungkook said simply. But I'd rather be real and lose the illusion than lie and keep it all pretty. Taehyung looked at him for a long time, chest rising and falling like he was trying to breathe in courage. I'm not ashamed of us, he said. Then stop hiding. So they agreed. Filming started in late November. The cameras were intrusive at first, but the crew was discreet, sensitive. The documentary wasn't about scandal or clickbait, it was about art, growth, healing. And somewhere along the way, Taehyung stopped filtering his words. He spoke about grief, about the person he lost, about the way he'd lost himself in the process. And then he spoke about Jungkook. Not with labels, but with truth. There's someone who stayed when I didn't even know I needed someone to, he said in a quiet clip filmed at dusk, his silhouette framed against a window overlooking the Han River. I didn't ask him to. I think that's what made it real. The moment went viral long before the documentary even aired. Fans dissected it frame by frame, breath by breath. And Jungkook, he just smiled when he saw it, not because it was a confirmation, but because it was a beginning. Then came the letter. Not from the past, but from the person Taehyung had once promised himself to. A handwritten letter, unsent for years, returned in a small envelope with no note, just the final line scribbled in a trembling script. I hope you found peace, even if it wasn't with me. Taehyung didn't cry when he read it. He simply folded it, pressed it flat between the pages of a journal he hadn't touched in months, and walked into the kitchen where Jungkook was rinsing rice for dinner. She wrote back, he said quietly. Jungkook turned, Are you okay? Taehyung nodded, Yeah, I am. That night he burned the last of the old letters. Not in anger, not in mourning, but in gratitude. They had shaped him, broken him, made him cautious, made him who he was, but he no longer needed to reread them to remember. He had a new story now. And it didn't need to be hidden. The year ended without grand declarations. No on-stage kisses. No magazine covers proclaiming BTS love story finally confirmed. Just two people who understood that love was less about spectacle and more about showing up, every day, even when it was hard, especially then. Taehyung didn't get married in 2027. Not because he didn't believe in love, but because he had stopped measuring his life in timelines set by anyone but himself. And Jungkook. He never asked for a ring. He asked to be chosen. And he was. Again and again, in the quiet moments. In shared breakfasts. In forgotten lyrics hummed under breath. In the way Taehyung always reached for his hand without looking. In every version of their future that didn't need a stage to be real. Because love, real love, doesn't always end in marriage. Sometimes it simply begins, and keeps beginning, every single day. The new year arrived not with fireworks or extravagant parties, but with the sound of rain against their apartment windows and the warmth of Taehyung's palm resting lazily over Jungkook's heartbeat. They hadn't gone out. No broadcasts, no performances. Just the two of them curled under an old blanket, the smell of tangerines and coffee lingering between them, muted laughter from the television casting flickers of color against the darkened room. The world outside buzzed with resolutions and expectations, but inside their little space, nothing was asked, nothing demanded. They existed without the pressure to be more than what they already were. Taehyung lay half asleep, his lashes fluttering against his cheek, his face pressed into the crook of Jungkook's neck like he was hiding from the past and breathing into the future all at once. There was something in that stillness that Jungkook wished he could bottle, something sacred, unshaken by time or headlines or the ghosts that still sometimes lingered in Taehyung's silences. I used to think I'd marry before I turned 30, Taehyung murmured, voice low, almost inaudible. Jungkook didn't move, he only hummed, because it sounded right or because you wanted to. Taehyung's breath caught for a second before he answered, "Because I thought that's what happiness looked like. And now, I think happiness looks a lot like this," he whispered, tracing slow circles into Jungkook's chest. Quiet, unexpected, undemanding. Jungkook turned to look at him, eyes heavy with something unsaid. "So you don't need the wedding, the cake, the vows." "I need presence," Taehyung said. "I need you when my hands shake. I need someone who doesn't need to fix me to love me." "You have that," Jungkook said without hesitation. "You've always had that." Taehyung blinked up at him, eyes soft but guarded. "Even if I never say the words." Jungkook smiled faintly. "You say them every time you let me stay." Time moved differently after that. The weeks stretched in gentle rhythm. Taehyung picked up his camera again, wandering the streets of Seoul with a scarf wrapped high on his face, capturing pieces of the world that didn't know it was being seen. Jungkook would often tag along, not to interfere but to watch the way Taehyung moved when no one was watching. Sometimes he'd photograph Taehyung instead, his hands adjusting the lens, his brows furrowed in concentration, his smile peaking when he caught a frame just right. Taehyung never told him to stop. He just handed Jungkook the strap of his own camera one afternoon and said, "If we're capturing the world, you should be in it too." Their lives were no longer separate, but they weren't merged either. It wasn't about fusion. It was about coexistence, a shared space with two beating hearts still learning how to beat in sync. One evening, they were invited to a private gallery exhibit. A friend of Taehyung's had curated a collection called Unspoken Things, intimate portraits, candid moments, forgotten corners of the city lit with the soft hush of twilight. As they stepped into the room, dimly lit and humming with conversation, Taehyung stilled. Jungkook followed his gaze and saw it, a photo. A familiar backlit silhouette standing alone on a rooftop, head tilted to the sky like he was asking it something only he could hear. It was Taehyung, the version of him from 2 winters ago, fragile, lost, beautiful in his solitude. "You submitted this?" Jungkook asked quietly. Taehyung nodded, his voice barely a breath. "I needed to let him go." Jungkook didn't speak. He just reached for Taehyung's hand and held it right there in front of everyone. No hiding, no masks. And Taehyung didn't pull away. It was enough. Later that night, back home, Taehyung stood by the window while Jungkook lit a candle in the kitchen. The glow stretched across the walls like soft gold, warm and quiet. Taehyung didn't turn around when he spoke. "Do you think people will ever understand why I won't get married?" Jungkook leaned against the doorway. "They don't need to, it's not for them. But it feels like I'm disappointing someone." "You're not," Jungkook said gently. "You're just choosing differently. And sometimes, the most honest thing we can do is choose what doesn't make sense to anyone but ourselves." Taehyung turned finally, his eyes tired but clear. "I love you, Jungkook." There it was. No fireworks, no grand stage. Just words. Real, simple, heavy. Jungkook walked to him, closing the space between them, resting his forehead against Taehyung's. "You don't have to prove it," he whispered, "but thank you for saying it anyway." Taehyung kissed him, soft, lingering, like a memory being made in real time. That night they didn't make promises. They just stayed. And as the days went on, nothing monumental happened. No announcements, no interviews declaring their truth. But the way Taehyung's hand always found Jungkook, in the dark, told a story louder than any press release ever could. The world continued to spin. BTS members pursued their paths, their lives unfolding in beautiful, unpredictable ways. Fans still speculated as they always would, but Jungkook and Taehyung existed in the space between the noise. Quiet, steady, deeply rooted. Taehyung still got questions. When will you marry? Who's the lucky one? Is it true you swore off love? And every time he'd smile, a soft tilt of the lips, and say, "I haven't sworn off love. I just know what mine looks like now." He didn't need the applause. He had something better. He had mornings tangled in shared bedsheets. He had music composed in the silence between breaths. He had laughter in grocery aisles and fingers interlaced beneath cafe tables. He had a home that didn't have an address, but answered every time he called. And most of all, he had a love that didn't demand a title to be true. This was why Taehyung wouldn't get married in 2027. Because he already had everything he needed. And Jungkook, he understood. Because the kind of love they had wasn't meant to be performed. It was meant to be lived. They stopped keeping track of how many nights they fell asleep with their hands tangled between pillows or how many mornings Taehyung woke to find Jungkook already awake, just watching him like he was memorizing the shape of peace. Some people needed noise to feel alive. Taehyung, for the longest time, thought he was one of them. But the stillness Jungkook brought didn't feel like silence. It felt like safety, like a song that played even after the last note. But safety, even the softest kind, wasn't without its ghosts. There were days when Taehyung would go quiet again, long stretches where his words turned inward and his body moved through the world like he was only partially there. Jungkook learned not to take it personally. He'd leave space instead of questions, a warm drink on the nightstand, a jacket on the chair before Taehyung left the house, a quiet light left on in the hallway. That was how he said, "I'm here when you're ready." And when Taehyung was ready, he always came back, with trembling hands sometimes, with tears that surprised even him, with stories that came out in fragments, about dreams he abandoned in the middle of building them, about moments he lost before he could frame them in lyrics. One night after a long walk home beneath the bare-boned trees of winter, Taehyung stood by the window, arms crossed, watching snow fall for the first time that year. His voice came suddenly, breaking the quiet. "I used to imagine myself walking down the aisle," he said, almost amused at the memory. "Not for the ceremony, for the silence before the vows. I used to think if I could stand in that silence and still breathe, maybe I was ready." Jungkook looked up from where he sat on the couch, a book resting on his chest. "And now?" Taehyung turned, eyes soft but unflinching. "Now I don't need that silence to prove anything. I have it every day with you." He crossed the room, slow, deliberate, and sat beside Jungkook, the quiet between them stretching like a thread pulled taut. Then, without hesitation, Taehyung laid his head against Jungkook's chest and whispered, "You're the only thing that ever made me feel married to something real." Jungkook's fingers threaded gently into his hair, his thumb brushing a slow line behind Taehyung's ear. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. Days later, when the documentary aired, the internet exploded. There were messages, tweets, breakdowns of every scene, every glance, every pause. But the part that made everything stop, the part that echoed through timelines and conversations and headlines, was a single moment near the end. Taehyung sitting under low light, his voice even and vulnerable. "I won't get married in 2027, not because I'm afraid, not because I've given up, but because the kind of love I have doesn't need an audience to be sacred." He paused, looked just off camera and smiled. "It found me when I stopped performing. It stayed when I had nothing left to offer but truth, and every day I choose it again." The scene faded out, but the silence it left behind said more than the quote ever could. Jungkook watched it from the kitchen, arms folded, unsure if he was allowed to cry over something he already lived through. But when Taehyung stepped in behind him, wrapped his arms around Jungkook's waist, and whispered, "That was for you," Jungkook let his eyes close and finally let the tears come. Not from pain, but from the kind of gratitude that comes only when you realize you were seen, fully and without condition. That winter they took a short trip to the coast. No stylists, no managers, no schedules, just them, a borrowed car and a camera bag Taehyung refused to leave behind. They stayed in a cottage where the waves whispered against the rocks and the wind tasted like salt and quiet rebellion. In the mornings, Taehyung cooked with music playing low and loose in the background, while Jungkook sketched song ideas into his journal, his feet always cold because he kept forgetting to wear socks. On the third night, as they stood on the porch beneath a sky littered with stars, Taehyung handed Jungkook his camera and said, "Take a picture of me not being afraid." Jungkook did. Then he lowered the lens, walked across the wooden deck, and kissed him with both hands on Taehyung's face. "Do you still miss her?" Jungkook asked quietly afterward. Taehyung didn't answer immediately. He looked out at the ocean, the tide pulling itself toward the horizon like a memory that never learned how to stay gone. "I don't think I miss her," he said. "I think I miss the version of me who loved her without fear. And now I love differently, but maybe braver." They didn't make promises, they just built days, and those days became weeks, then months, then something unnamed and permanent. When the first cherry blossoms of the season bloomed, Jungkook surprised Taehyung with a framed print of that photo from the coast. On the back, he'd written 4 words. "You were never afraid." Taehyung stared at it for a long time before turning to Jungkook and saying, "Neither were you." It wasn't marriage, but it was home. And for two people who had once thought they needed the world's permission to be whole, it was everything. Because not all love stories need to end in vows. Some just need a quiet place to begin again. Spring rolled in gently, the kind of soft, slow arrival that didn't announce itself with bold colors but whispered into the cracks of winter's silence. The mornings were lighter, the air no longer biting, and in the early hours when the world was still rubbing the sleep from its eyes, Taehyung would sit by the window with his knees pulled up to his chest, a mug cradled in his palms, and let the sun pour over him like a quiet baptism. Some mornings, Jungkook would wake up to find him there, motionless except for the occasional rise and fall of his chest. He didn't interrupt. He just walked over, slid down beside him, and leaned against his shoulder until the sun reached both of them. They had learned to speak in silences. They had learned to live in spaces that weren't hurried or defined by what came next. It was late March when the news broke. Another member of the group had announced plans for a formal ceremony, a spring wedding that would be quiet, elegant, and shared only in part with the public. Fans rejoiced, media outlets speculated, and messages flooded Taehyung's inbox once again. "Will you be next? Do you believe in marriage now? Who would you marry if not her?" He read them, all of them, slowly, carefully. And then he closed his phone, slid it into the drawer beside his bed, and walked into the living room where Jungkook was halfway through a demo track. The melody was soft, introspective, layered with synths and echoes that sounded like memory. Taehyung didn't speak right away. He just listened. When the track ended, Jungkook looked up, too slow. Taehyung shook his head. "Too honest," he said, in a good way. They smiled at each other. Not like a couple hiding something, but like two people who'd built something sacred that didn't need defining. Later that night, Taehyung opened his notebook, not the old one filled with letters to someone he no longer held onto, but a new one. The pages were clean, untouched. He opened to the first page and wrote in block letters across the top, "The things I never said out loud." Then he began to write. "I didn't choose you because you were the loudest love. I chose you because you were the quietest truth. Because when the noise faded and the world turned away, you stayed." He tore out the page, folded it carefully, and left it on Jungkook's desk under the edge of a sketchbook he knew Jungkook would open in the morning. He didn't sign it. He didn't need to. Jungkook found it before sunrise, the paper cool to the touch, the handwriting unmistakably Taehyung's. He didn't say anything when they met in the kitchen that morning. He just reached for Taehyung's hand as he poured his tea, slid his fingers over his knuckles, and looked at him the way he always had, like he'd wait another lifetime just to be chosen again. Time didn't speed up or slow down after that. It moved as it always had, indifferent to their healing, unaware of how long it had taken to reach this peace. And they let it move. They no longer raced it. They lived inside of it. On Taehyung's birthday, Jungkook surprised him with a small photo book. No captions, no filters, just pictures, moments Jungkook had collected quietly over the months. Taehyung sleeping on a train, his head against the window. Taehyung smiling mid-bite of a too spicy dish. Taehyung barefoot in the studio, arms stretched over his head during a break in recording. And the last photo, a candid shot of Taehyung standing in the center of their shared kitchen, sunlight painting lines across his skin, holding a bowl of rice like he'd just come home from somewhere farther than the world could measure. Taehyung ran his fingers over the final page. "You never asked me to pose," he said. Jungkook leaned closer, voice quiet. "You're always enough without trying." That night, under soft lights and the remnants of cake, Taehyung whispered into the hollow of Jungkook's neck, "If I ever do get married, it'll be to someone who made me believe again." Jungkook kissed his shoulder. "Then I hope you believe again." Taehyung pulled back just enough to look him in the eye. "I think I already do." They didn't need rings to feel tethered. They didn't need legal language to affirm what had already been lived. But they did talk about forever, not in grand, sweeping declarations, but in the way they planned holidays, in the way they decorated their hallway with shared art, in the way Jungkook talked about building a studio in the countryside and Taehyung said, "Only if there's a window that faces the east." One morning, mid-April, Taehyung found Jungkook in the garden, kneeling in the soil, hands dirty and face flushed. He had planted something, Taehyung realized, a small row of white hyacinths. "You planted flowers?" Taehyung asked, amused, leaning against the doorway. Jungkook looked up, squinting against the sun. "They bloom even in fractured soil." Taehyung stepped barefoot into the yard, crouched beside him. "You think we're fractured?" "I think we were," Jungkook said, "but not anymore." They tended to the flowers together, side by side, hands brushing occasionally, the dirt beneath their nails a kind of poetry. Later, they sat under the shade of a tree, Taehyung's head resting in Jungkook's lap, watching bees hover lazily above the blossoms. "I used to think marriage was the destination," Taehyung said softly. "And now?" "Now I think it's just one of many roads," he replied. "But this feels like home no matter what road we take." Jungkook smiled, brushing a strand of hair from Taehyung's face. "Then let's never stop walking it." They didn't announce anything to the world. No one posted matching rings or coordinated outfits or cryptic captions. But when fans saw them together, quietly laughing outside a bookstore or leaning into each other during a festival, they knew. Not because it was loud, but because it was real. And so, 2027 came and went. No tuxedos, no aisles, no headlines about designer suits or secret guest lists. Just two people who had loved, lost, and found their way back to each other through silence, patience, and unwavering presence. This was why Taehyung didn't get married in 2027. Because what he had was already more honest than any promise he could make under a roof filled with flowers and strangers. Because what they had didn't need to be proven. It just needed to be lived. Summer didn't arrive like a celebration. It crept in through open windows, through the scent of damp earth and jasmine, through the hum of cicadas in the stillness of late afternoons. It made its presence known not with heat, but with color, the rich green of leaves, the golden hue of light that lingered longer on their skin, the faded denim blue of Taehyung's worn shirt that Jungkook always reached for on days he needed comfort. Their lives had settled into something that felt nothing like settling. It was rhythm, shared toothbrushes, grocery lists with inside jokes scribbled between ingredients, a fridge magnet from a road trip they never talked about publicly, music that played quietly in the background of their lives, not to be released, not for charts, just for them. They still hadn't defined anything, and they didn't need to. There were days when they spent hours apart, Taehyung lost in his sketches, Jungkook running laps or locked in the booth with nothing but his breath and a microphone. And when they came back together, no words were needed to close the space between them. Jungkook would find Taehyung asleep on the floor of his studio, and instead of waking him, he'd sit beside him, tracing the lines of a half-finished drawing. Taehyung would find Jungkook with his forehead pressed to a piano key, lost in a melody that hadn't found its voice yet, and without saying anything, he'd press a single note beside him, just enough to let Jungkook know he wasn't alone. One evening, after a storm had passed and left the sky raw with orange and soft purple, Taehyung sat on the roof of their building, knees pulled up to his chest, the edge of his sweater sleeves frayed from years of nervous hands. Jungkook joined him quietly, handing him a bottle of cold tea and sitting close enough for their arms to touch. They watched the sky in silence for a long while before Taehyung spoke. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm cheating the world," he said. Jungkook turned. "What do you mean?" "By not giving them what they expect," he murmured. "By not being the version of me they imagined, married, settled, giving them a beautiful, curated love story." Jungkook leaned back, his fingers threading into Taehyung's. "You're not cheating the world, you're being honest with it." "But what if they think I'm broken?" "Then let them," Jungkook said simply. "They don't know the hours you spent learning how to hold yourself together. They don't know what it took to love again, not loudly but safely." Taehyung didn't answer, but his head dropped onto Jungkook's shoulder, and that was enough. That weekend, they disappeared into the countryside. No one knew where they went. No photographers followed. They stayed in a quiet inn surrounded by hills and hydrangeas, where the stars looked close enough to touch, and the air smelled like old wood and rain. It was there, in a room with uneven floors and curtains that fluttered like breath, that Taehyung opened his sketchbook and showed Jungkook something he hadn't shared with anyone. Drawings. Dozens of them. Of hands, of shoulders, of half-hidden smiles, of Jungkook captured in ways only someone who had studied him for years could manage. "I never knew how to draw you fully," Taehyung said, "because you were always changing." Jungkook reached out, flipped through the pages slowly, "But you kept trying." "I never stopped," Taehyung said, "even when I hated myself for still loving you." Jungkook looked up at him, voice low. "Did you?" "For a while," Taehyung confessed, "because it felt like I didn't deserve to." "And now?" Taehyung closed the sketchbook, set it aside, and reached out to touch the side of Jungkook's neck, his fingers warm and trembling. "Now I know love isn't about deserving, it's about choosing, and I choose you." Jungkook didn't respond with words. He closed the space between them with a kiss, soft and slow and deliberate, like punctuation to a sentence they'd been writing for years without realizing. That night, wrapped in each other beneath thin sheets and the scent of jasmine wafting in from the open window, they didn't make promises. But Taehyung whispered, "If I ever do change my mind about marriage, it won't be because the world wants me to." Jungkook's thumb traced the curve of his spine. "It'll be because you want it." "And because," Taehyung said, lips brushing his ear, "you were always the one I'd say yes to." They didn't speak more after that. Their bodies did the talking. Slow, reverent, intentional, not rushed, not about desire, about presence, about the kind of intimacy that only comes from years of being seen and still being loved. When they returned to the city, something was different, not between them but around them. A calm, a quiet kind of joy that followed them like shadow. People noticed. They always did. But this time, the rumors didn't feel invasive. They felt like echoes of something inevitable. When Taehyung released his next art series, it was titled The Unnamed. It wasn't about heartbreak or past lovers or distant memories. It was about stillness, warmth, presence. One piece stood out, a figure curled under a blanket of light, half of his face obscured by a cascade of light, the other glowing from the gentle hand reaching in from out of frame. Critics called it haunting, beautiful, intimate. They didn't know it was Jungkook's hand. Taehyung never confirmed it. He didn't need to. The world kept asking why Taehyung wouldn't marry, and Taehyung kept answering without words. In the way he looked at Jungkook during award shows when the lights dimmed. In the way Jungkook reached for him first when the crowd grew too loud. In the way their lives interwove, quietly, irrevocably. They weren't married. Not legally. Not publicly. But in every way that mattered, in the choices, the silences, the way Taehyung's toothbrush always ended up next to Jungkook's, they were something deeper. Something sacred. Something chosen. And long after the questions faded, long after the headlines stopped chasing their shadows, they remained. Not because they had something to prove, but because they had nothing left to hide.